The billionaire CEO smiled when she said it, a practiced smile, polished and deliberate, the kind she wore in boardrooms and on the covers of business magazines. She had rehearsed the line in her head a dozen times before dinner, turning it over like a coin she wasn't sure she wanted to spend. "My father says I need a husband." She said it lightly, almost as a joke, expecting the man across the table to laugh, or lean forward with flattery, or at least raise his glass in the gentle, knowing way men usually did when a wealthy, beautiful woman left a door slightly open. She was used to that. She was used to all of it, the predictable choreography of attraction wrapped in ambition, the hunger dressed up as charm. Most men she had ever met saw her fortune first. Some saw her beauty. Others calculated her power like a column in a spreadsheet. But this quiet man, this ordinary man in a flannel shirt, with a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him, simply looked at her with steady brown eyes and shook his head. "No," he said calmly. Not unkindly. Not dismissively. Just clearly. "You don't need a husband." The words landed in the space between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Amelia Carter, 36 years old, CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology conglomerates in the country, a woman who had delivered keynotes before thousands of people without flinching, felt her breath catch. And then he added something she had not expected at all. "The real question is whether you're capable of loving someone when they have nothing left to offer, except their heart." For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely nothing to say. Amelia Carter had spent the better part of her adult life building things. Not just the company, though the company was extraordinary by any measure. A technology firm she had grown from a 3-person startup in her late 20s into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise with offices in 14 cities and a workforce that numbered in the thousands. She had built her reputation, her discipline, her armor. She had built the version of herself that appeared in profile features and on panels at industry conferences. The version that spoke about disruption and vision and the courage required to fail forward. That version was admired. That version was credible. That version won awards. What that version never quite managed to build was peace. Her penthouse apartment in downtown Denver occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building she had once helped finance. The view was extraordinary, city lights splayed out in every direction like a constellation laid flat, and she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows some evenings, not out of pleasure but out of habit, the way people sometimes stand in rooms and forget why they entered. The apartment was tasteful, minimalist, and quiet, in a way that felt less like serenity and more like absence. There were no photographs on the refrigerator, no shoes by the door that weren't hers. No evidence, anywhere, that the life inside those walls belonged to more than one person. She told herself she preferred it that way. Her assistant had cleared her calendar every third Sunday so she could visit her father, Richard Carter, who lived in the same modest brick house in Aurora where he had raised her after her mother passed. He was 71 now, slower than he used to be, with a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended with the same methodical care he had once applied to raising a headstrong daughter. He made sandwiches when she came over. He made coffee too strong, and without fail, without exception, at some point during every visit, he set down his mug and looked at her with the particular expression she had come to brace herself for, not unkind, but relentless. "You have the company," he would say. "I know that. You have the money. I know that too. But Amelia, you don't have a family, and I'm not going to be here forever." She always deflected. She talked about the board meeting scheduled for the following week, or the acquisition she was evaluating, or the team she was building. She answered his question with different questions. Her father, who had been a high school civics teacher for 34 years and was therefore almost impossible to redirect, simply waited. He had learned patience the slow way. He had waited through her teenage silences, and her college absences, and her decade of relentless professional climbing. He waited now with the same quiet persistence, and somewhere underneath Amelia's deflections, beneath the efficiency and the confidence and the practiced certainty, a small, uncomfortable question had begun to surface. What if he was right? What if the life she had constructed so carefully, so deliberately, so impressively, was missing something she had not allowed herself to name? She pushed the thought aside. She was good at that. But the week her father sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not gentle persistence, but something closer to genuine worry, she understood that the conversation had changed. "I want you to find someone," he said. "Not a business partner. Not a networked connection. Someone. Before you turn 37. Amelia, I'm asking you seriously." It was the closest thing to an ultimatum he had ever given her. She drove home that evening with both hands tight on the wheel and the radio off. And for once, she did not have a plan. She made the attempt. Of course she did. Amelia Carter did not receive a challenge and ignore it. Even when the challenge came from her own father, and the objective was something as unquantifiable as love, she approached it the way she approached most things, with structure, with intention, and with a certain confidence that the right solution existed if she could identify the correct variables. She even made a list. Not because she was unromantic, she had been romantic once, in her late 20s, briefly and painfully, before the company had absorbed everything, but because a list clarified what she actually valued when she was forced to write it down. She wanted someone who was genuinely accomplished in their own right, someone intellectually curious, someone who understood ambition without being consumed by it, someone who did not need anything from her that she was not freely willing to give. It seemed like a reasonable list. It turned out to be almost entirely beside the point. Over the following 3 months, she went on 9 dates. The men were, by every conventional measure, impressive. A corporate attorney who had argued cases before state supreme courts and wore his watch on his right wrist because he had read somewhere that it indicated ambition. A cardiovascular surgeon with a charitable foundation and a carefully curated sense of humor. A venture capitalist who had backed 3 unicorn companies before 40 and spoke about the future with the breathless urgency of someone who believed he was shaping it. A former professional athlete turned brand consultant with cheekbones that belonged in a museum, and a manner so polished it occasionally felt frictionless. 2 of them sent flowers the following morning. One sent a handwritten note on monogrammed stationery. One texted a single word, remarkable, which she supposed was a compliment. She sat across from all of them in good restaurants, with good wine, and gave each conversation her genuine attention. She listened. She asked real questions. She offered real answers. And one by one, she noticed the same thing, not rudely, not with malice, but with a clarity that accumulated into something she could not dismiss. Every single one of them was more interested in the architecture of her success than in the person inside it. They wanted to know about the company's growth trajectory. They asked about her investment strategy, her board relationships, her vision for the next 5 years. One of them spent most of their second hour comparing their respective deal flow. Another asked, with the casual ease of someone who had rehearsed it, whether she had ever considered expanding into Southeast Asian markets. She noticed how their eyes moved when other people in the restaurant recognized her. She noticed the small but unmistakable shift in posture that happened whenever her status was confirmed in some way. She was not naive about it. She had understood since her early 30s that wealth and power rearranged the social geometry of every room she entered. She had accepted it as a condition of the life she had chosen. What she had not fully accepted, not until a Tuesday evening in April, when a man who introduced himself as a portfolio manager leaned back in his chair and said with what he probably thought was refreshing honesty, "I'll be straight with you, if you weren't who you are, would we even be sitting here right now?" She had not accepted that the question itself would hit her the way it did. Not with anger. With something quieter and more corrosive. With the particular exhaustion of someone who has been looking in the wrong direction for a very long time and has finally stopped pretending otherwise. She left the restaurant before dessert. She sat in her car in the parking structure for 11 minutes, watching the fluorescent lights above her hum in the silence, thinking about how many people she had met who treated her like a destination rather than a person. Then she drove to the airport and rebooked a flight she had been scheduled to take in 2 days, because she had a quarterly review to conduct at the Colorado operations office, and she decided she would rather be working than sitting in her penthouse staring at city lights, and thinking about a question she did not yet know how to answer. The coffee shop was not the kind of place she would normally stop. It had no app, no loyalty program, no branded merchandise hanging on the walls. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on a side street in a small Colorado town she had passed through half a dozen times, without noticing, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read simply, Brooks Coffee, in careful dark lettering, and mismatched chairs that looked like they had been sourced from estate sales and given a second life. A small chalkboard in the window listed 3 items. 3 items. She had been to coffee establishments with menus that scrolled for minutes and still failed to produce something worth drinking. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the early morning mountain light, looking at the hand-painted sign, and felt something she did not immediately identify, which turned out, on reflection, to be the particular relief of something uncomplicated. She went in because the hotel coffee had been undrinkable, and because her meeting did not start for another 90 minutes, and because though she would not have articulated it this way at the time, she was tired of optimized spaces, and was obscurely drawn to something that looked like it had simply been allowed to be itself. The man behind the counter was not what she expected. He was perhaps 37, with dark hair that needed a cut, and the kind of unhurried steadiness in his movements that suggested he had chosen this pace deliberately rather than defaulted to it. He was not performing anything. He was not making small talk with the practiced warmth of someone trying to generate tips. He was simply doing his work, taking orders, preparing drinks, wiping down the counter, speaking to a regular customer with the natural ease of someone who had known the person for years. His name, she would learn later, was Ethan Brooks. He wore a faded gray shirt and work boots that had seen actual work, and on the ring finger of his left hand, slightly dulled from use but clearly kept, was a wedding band he had not removed. She sat at a corner table with her laptop open and noticed, without meaning to, the particular care with which he moved through the space, the way he adjusted the chair of an elderly woman who had come in from the cold, the way he remembered without being asked that a young man near the window took his Americano without sugar, the way he checked on the corner table twice, not to upsell anything but apparently just to see if she needed something. He had not recognized her. She was certain of that. There was none of the subtle recalibration she was used to, none of the almost imperceptible change in energy that happened when someone realized who she was. He brought her a second coffee without her asking for it, set it down with a quiet, "You looked like you could use it," and went back to what he was doing. She watched him for the rest of the hour, telling herself it was merely observation, the natural curiosity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. But there was something in his quality of presence that was more difficult to categorize than she was comfortable admitting. A man who appeared to have made a thorough peace with exactly the life he was living, without apology or explanation, or the subtle, ongoing negotiation with ambition that she recognized in almost everyone around her. When she packed up her laptop and walked to the counter to pay, she found herself asking, with the same directness she brought to most things, whether he would like to have dinner. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite categorize. Not surprised, exactly, but something more like thoughtful. "Sure," he said. "I know a place." She walked back to her car with the coffee in her hand and the specific, unfamiliar feeling of someone who had made a spontaneous decision they could not immediately analyze their way out of. The restaurant he suggested was small and genuinely good, the kind of place locals protect by not talking about it too loudly. They sat at a table near a window with a view of the mountains going dark against an early evening sky. And the conversation moved, as good conversations do, sideways and then deeper before either of them had mapped where it was going. She told him more than she usually told people. She wasn't sure exactly why. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was the residue of that Tuesday evening in April still working its way through her. Maybe it was simply that he asked questions without agenda, real questions, the kind that require the person asking them to actually listen to the answer. She told him about her father and his garden and his coffee that was always too strong. She told him about the relentless drumbeat of his concern, the way love sometimes arrives, dressed as pressure. She told him, with more honesty than she had offered anyone in recent memory, about the 9 dates and the portfolio manager, and the exhaustion that had settled into her somewhere over the last year like weather that wouldn't move. She was not performing vulnerability. She was simply tired of performing its absence. And then, because she had been thinking about it, and because she was Amelia Carter, and did not often waste time with indirection, she said it. "My father says I need a husband." She said it with the edge of a smile, half challenge and half something she couldn't name. She was used to what came next. She was ready for the lean forward, the careful flattery, the conversation that would suddenly and smoothly redirect toward possibility. Ethan Brooks looked at her across the table and shook his head. "No," he said. Simply, cleanly, without cruelty. "You don't need a husband." The silence that followed had a texture to it. She opened her mouth and found nothing waiting. "What you need," he continued, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, "is someone who loves you for who you actually are. Not what you've built, not what you can offer. You." He paused, and something shifted slightly in his expression, not hesitation, but care. "And honestly, the real question isn't whether you can find that person. It's whether you're capable of letting them love you when there's nothing practical in it for either of you, when they have nothing left to offer except their heart." The mountains had gone fully dark outside. The restaurant had filled up around them. She sat very still for a moment that lasted longer than she could measure. And then she picked up her glass and looked at him with an expression she had not worn in public in a very long time. Open, uncertain, and completely without performance. "You have a ring on," she said. "I noticed." He looked down at his left hand. He did not remove it, or explain it away, or offer the reflexive deflection she might have expected. "My wife passed away," he said. 3 years ago. Her name was Sarah. I keep it because she was real, and I don't want to pretend otherwise." There was nothing in his voice except honesty. The dinner went on another hour. She drove back to the hotel through mountain darkness and sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, thinking about a man who had refused a door she had opened. He had given her his number when she left, and she had told herself she would think carefully before using it. She thought carefully for approximately 36 hours. Then she called him and asked if they could talk again, and he said yes in the same unhurried way he said everything. What she did not tell him, not yet, not for weeks, was that before she called, she had asked the question she always asked when a situation required clarity. She had asked what she did not yet understand. She had made quiet inquiries. Not deep investigation, not surveillance, she was not that person. But she had asked the kinds of questions a careful person asks, and the answers that came back rearranged everything she thought she knew about Ethan Brooks. Over the phone that second evening, she asked him directly, "You don't want to get married again?" His answer came back slowly, with the thoughtfulness of someone who had considered it before and was giving her not a rehearsed response, but a genuine one. "It's not about wanting or not wanting," he said. "After Sarah got sick, after everything that happened, I stopped thinking about marriage as something I was working toward. I started thinking about what actually matters. My daughter Lily, the people who are still here, what I owe to the life I have, not the life I had planned." He paused. "I don't need a wife. What I'd need from anyone is someone who could genuinely respect and care about the people I love. Not as an obligation. Because they actually wanted to." She was sitting at her desk in Denver by then, having returned from Colorado with more in her head than she had taken with her. The city stretched out beyond her windows in the late afternoon. She thought about the word genuinely. She thought about how rarely she heard it used without irony or strategy. "Tell me about Lily," she said, and he did for the better part of an hour, while she sat at her desk with her laptop closed for the first time all week, just listening. She did not know, listening to him describe his daughter 7 years old, obsessed with sea turtles and the color orange, possessed of an opinion about everything, and a laugh that arrived before she had finished whatever had amused her. She did not know about the other thing. Not yet. She knew he was a single father running a coffee shop in a small Colorado town. And she had been moved by his decency and disarmed by his honesty, and quietly, helplessly drawn to the fact that he was the first person in years who had looked at her and seen through the architecture rather than admiring it. She had found herself, in the days after their dinner, returning to his words, in the way you return to a song you hear once and cannot get out of your head, not because the melody is complicated, but because something in it is exactly right. What she did not yet know was what she learned when she made deeper inquiries not to investigate him, she told herself, but because she was a person who needed to understand the full picture before she allowed herself to trust it. And there was a part of her that was waiting for the detail that would make him ordinary, the fine print that would explain the dissonance between who he appeared to be and who people actually were. She was prepared to be disappointed. She had been disappointed before. The answer that came back from a business journalist she trusted stopped her mid-sentence in a meeting she had been running. She asked her assistant to reschedule the afternoon. She sat alone in the conference room with a folder of information and read it twice. Ethan Brooks had not always been a coffee shop owner in Colorado. 10 years ago, he had been the co-founder of a software logistics company that, at its peak, had been valued at close to $90 million. He had been 32 years old, married to Sarah for 3 years, and Lily had not yet been born. The company had been on the trajectory that venture-backed startups dream about: accelerating revenue, a strategic acquisition offer on the table, a future that looked like everything he had worked toward. And then, Sarah had been diagnosed. The specifics of her illness were not public record. What was traceable, through SEC filings, and the kind of corporate history that gets documented, even when no one is paying close attention, was that Ethan had declined the acquisition offer. He had stepped back from the CEO role. He had liquidated a substantial portion of his equity stake, tens of millions of dollars, not to invest elsewhere, not to preserve personal capital, but to fund care, specialized treatment, clinical trials, the best physicians available, a team of home care providers so that Sarah could stay home during the hardest months, surrounded by people who knew her name. He had not negotiated partial involvement. He had not tried to hold on to both things. He had simply chosen, without apparent hesitation, and the choice had been Sarah. He had done all of this without fanfare, without press releases, without any of the public narrative that people in his position sometimes constructed around sacrifice. The company had eventually been sold without him, after his departure, to a larger logistics firm. Ethan had taken nothing from the sale. By the time Sarah passed away 3 years ago now, when Lily was 4, he had quietly reoriented his entire life around his daughter and a coffee shop in a town where, by all appearances, no one knew what he had given up, and he had never once suggested they should. Amelia sat in the empty conference room until the light outside changed from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early evening. She was not a person who cried easily. She had conditioned that out of herself somewhere in her early 30s, deciding it was a vulnerability she could not afford in the environments she moved through. But she sat very still with her hands flat on the table and felt something in the vicinity of her chest, doing something she did not have an immediately professional name for. He had been richer than most of the men she had dated. Not just richer, more successful, more driven, more capable of exactly the kind of strategic vision she recognized from her own life, and he had spent every bit of it on love, quietly, without an audience, without a byline. And then, he had never told anyone. He had simply gone on making coffee for strangers in a mountain town, wearing a ring that still fit, raising a daughter who loved sea turtles, and asking nothing from the world in return for what he had given it. She recognized the shape of that. She recognized the character of someone who had found out what they were made of under pressure and had been made of something that held. And she thought, sitting alone in that conference room, with the folder closed in front of her, that she had been looking at exactly the wrong list. The weeks after that discovery moved differently than weeks usually moved for Amelia Carter. She had always experienced time as something to be managed, structured, optimized every hour, accountable to a calendar. Every calendar, accountable to a quarter, every quarter feeding into the long arc of a company. She was steering toward a horizon she had defined for herself. She had been good at this. She had been extraordinary at it. Time spent with Ethan Brooks began to feel like something else, not unstructured, exactly, but differently structured. organized around small things rather than large ones. She drove to Colorado more often than her schedule technically justified. She sat in the coffee shop in the mornings with her laptop open and did actual work, but found herself looking up at intervals to watch the way he moved through the space, the particular quality of attention he gave to everyone who came through the door. She met Lily on a Saturday afternoon in late May, in the park behind the coffee shop where Ethan took her on slow weekend mornings. Lily was exactly as he had described, her bright-eyed and opinionated, wearing an orange jacket and explaining with complete authority why sea turtles were more important than most people understood. She shook Amelia's hand with a formality that was clearly something she had practiced and found hilarious, and then immediately asked if Amelia could name 3 species of sea turtle, which Amelia could not, which Lily found both appalling and entertaining in equal measure. They spent the rest of that afternoon at a picnic table in the park, and Lily taught Amelia about the leatherback and the loggerhead and the hawksbill, with the focused pedagogical intensity of someone who had decided that ignorance on this particular subject was not acceptable. Amelia drove home that evening with the window down despite the cold, feeling something she identified only slowly as the particular lightness of a day that had required nothing from her except to be present, no performance, no positioning, no management of how she was perceived. Just a park table and an orange jacket and facts about sea turtles she would actually remember. She told her assistant to block 2 Saturdays per month going forward. In the meantime, she watched and she listened, and she let herself, slowly and with some effort, begin to be known. She watched the way Ethan talked about Sarah, not with the performative grief of someone who had decided grief was part of his identity, but with the natural, unflinching acknowledgement of someone who had loved a real person and was not going to pretend that person had not existed. She watched the way he treated the people around him, the regulars at the shop, the suppliers who came through, the neighboring business owners who stopped in on slow afternoons. There was a consistency to it that she found, after a lifetime in environments where people's behavior shifted depending on who was in the room, genuinely startling. He was the same person in every context, and quietly, with the patience she had rarely offered anyone, he was watching her too, not to assess or analyze, but with the simple attentiveness of someone who had decided she was worth understanding. Her father called in June to ask when he would meet the man she had apparently been spending time with in Colorado, because her assistant had mentioned it to his neighbor, who had mentioned it to him at the garden fence, a chain of disclosure that she found both exasperating and oddly moving. She drove to Aurora on a Sunday with Ethan beside her in the passenger seat and the radio playing something neither of them acknowledged, and she felt the particular low-grade anxiety of a situation she could not fully control. She had managed international negotiations and hostile acquisitions and boardroom confrontations, where every person in the room had competing priorities and no one was willing to flinch. None of that had prepared her for the thought of her father and this man sitting across from each other at a kitchen table with 2 strong coffee between them. Her father's brick house looked smaller from the outside than it felt from the inside, the way houses do when you've grown up in them, and your sense of their scale was formed when you were shorter than the doorknobs. Richard Carter was standing in the front doorway before they had fully parked, and Amelia knew from the set of his shoulders that he had been deciding how to feel about this for weeks, turning it over at the garden fence. Probably the way he turned over most things that mattered. The afternoon was not comfortable, but it was honest. Her father was not a subtle man. He made coffee too strong and sandwiches nobody asked for, and within 20 minutes of sitting down with Ethan at the kitchen table, he said with the directness of a man who had spent decades teaching teenagers to think clearly, "I want to make something plain. My daughter has worked very hard for what she has. If you're here because of that, if what you're interested in is what she's built, I'll find that out eventually. And it won't end well for anyone." Ethan looked at Richard Carter with an expression that was not defensive and not deferential but simply direct. He said, "I understand why you'd think that. I'd think the same thing in your position." A pause that held the particular weight of honesty. "I can tell you that when I met your daughter, I didn't know who she was. Not for the first 2 conversations. And by the time I knew, it didn't change anything because I was already paying attention to her, not to the company." Richard Carter studied him for a long moment, with the appraising patience of a man who had read a great many students over the years and developed a reasonably reliable sense of who was telling the truth. Then he said, "I also want you to know that, if you wanted to, I could make things considerably easier for you. There are positions at Amelia's company. There are investment opportunities. I still have some standing in certain rooms." It was not a bribe exactly. It was a test, offered in the most reasonable possible terms, to see what the man across the table was made of when something was placed within reach. Ethan set down his coffee cup with a quietness that was itself an answer before the words arrived. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I appreciate that, genuinely. But if your daughter chooses me, if she ever chooses me, I want that to be because of who I am. Not because of what you can give me, or what she thinks she owes me, or any calculation at all, just because of who I am." The kitchen was quiet for a moment that felt larger than the room. The vegetable garden visible through the back window was orderly and green in the summer light. Richard Carter looked at his daughter across the table, and Amelia watched her father's face do something she had not seen it do in a very long time. She watched the suspicion drain out of it, and something else settle in its place. Something that looked, around the eyes, like relief, like a man who had been waiting a very long time for someone to say exactly that. The hardest conversation happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Ethan had driven to Denver the first time he had come to her city, rather than her coming to his, and they had walked along the river path near her office building, as the evening cooled and the last of the light lay flat across the water. She had been quiet for most of it, which was unusual. And he had let her be quiet in the particular way that some people cannot, filling the silence with noise, not asking if she was all right, just walking beside her and being available. She stopped at a place where the path curved and looked at the river moving steadily east and said, without turning to face him, "I've spent 11 years building a company. I know exactly how I did it. I know every decision, every pivot, every risk I took, and why I took it. I can explain it to anyone in any room." She paused long enough for a jogger to pass them and disappear around the bend. "But I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to build a life the way I built the company. I didn't practice it. I wasn't paying attention when I should have been, and somewhere in the last decade, I forgot that I was supposed to want it." The river kept moving. She finally turned to look at him. And the expression on her face was the one she almost never let anyone see. Not the CEO. Not the keynote speaker. Not the woman in the magazine profiles. Just a person. Just someone standing on a path at dusk with their hands in their jacket pockets, admitting to the specific and particular loneliness of having spent years building the wrong things in the wrong order, without knowing it until too late. "I spent years building a company," she said, more quietly now. "But I forgot how to build a life." Ethan was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking, rather than preparing. Then he said, "I know the feeling." She looked at him. "When Sarah died," he said, "I spent a long time thinking I had failed at the main thing. That the life I had planned, the one I had pictured, was gone, and there wasn't going to be another one. I was so focused on what had ended that I couldn't see what was still there." He looked at the river. "It took a long time to understand that building something new doesn't mean forgetting what you lost. It just means being willing to start again, even when starting again is the last thing you thought you'd have to do." She stood still on the river path in the cooling evening and felt the specific vulnerability of someone who has removed the last piece of armor they were wearing and is standing without it for the first time. "I'm afraid," she said. Not of the relationship exactly. She had sat with enough difficult things to know that was not the right word. Of the wanting, of the specific exposure of needing something she could not project manage into safety. Something she could not optimize or plan around or protect herself from by working harder. "So am I," he said. And the honesty of it, its simplicity, its completeness, the fact that he did not follow it with a reassurance or a qualifier, was the most intimate thing anyone had said to her in years. She reached out and took his hand on the river path. And he held it without ceremony, and the river kept going east. She chose her heart. She had always known she would, if she could find something worth choosing. Now, she had found it. and the choosing felt less like a decision and more like finally telling the truth about something she had known for a while. By October, the texture of her life had changed in ways that were sometimes difficult to name but easy to feel. She still ran the company. She still had the board meetings and the quarterly reviews and the decisions that came with leading an organization of that size and complexity. None of that had changed, nor had she wanted it to. What she had built was real, and she was proud of it, and she had not needed someone to tell her to set it aside, only to remember that it was not the whole of what she was. What had changed was the way the spaces between those things were filled. She drove to Colorado on weekends when she could. On the Saturdays she couldn't. Ethan drove to Denver with Lily, who had developed specific opinions about Amelia's kitchen and its inadequate supply of orange things. She had started cooking badly at first, with the focused determination she brought to new skills, and then with increasing competence and occasional genuine pleasure, standing at a counter she had barely used before with Lily perched on the island beside her, offering unsolicited guidance with the confidence of someone twice her age. She called her father more often, not because he had won the argument, though she suspected he would politely claim he had, but because she found herself wanting to sit at the kitchen table with the too strong coffee and talk about things that had nothing to do with earnings or strategy, talk about the garden and the neighborhood and the memories he carried that she was only now old enough to ask about. She found herself wanting to be in rooms where people knew her name for reasons that predated her net worth. Her team noticed something had shifted, though none of them could quite articulate what. She was no less present, no less sharp, no less capable of precision in the things that required precision. But there was an ease to her now that had not been there before, a quality of a person who has made peace with a question they had been avoiding, and finds, to their surprise, that the peace makes them more fully themselves rather than less. Ethan drove up to Denver one evening in late October, with Lily asleep in the back seat, and the three of them had dinner at Amelia's apartment, Lily waking just long enough to eat most of the pasta and deliver a critique of the portion sizes before falling back asleep on the sofa, and Richard Carter was there, having been invited for the first time to the penthouse, looking around at the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city lights with an expression of quiet wonder that moved her more than she expected. He shook Ethan's hand at the door when he arrived. He said, "I'm glad you came." Nothing else was required. The dinner was not extraordinary in any logistical sense. There was pasta and bread and 2 bottles of wine, and nobody discussed acquisitions or board dynamics or market positioning. Richard Carter and Ethan talked about the garden, which Ethan had apparently been reading about, which was the precise correct subject to choose, with a 71-year-old man who had been growing vegetables for 30 years and had strong opinions about soil composition. Lily slept on the sofa with Amelia's cashmere throw over her shoulders and her orange jacket balled up under her head as a pillow. Her breathing slow and perfectly even, the sleep of a child who is entirely secure in the world around her. The city glittered outside the windows, in all its enormous indifferent brilliance, and around the table in the warm light, the people who had been sitting separately in their respective lives were simply present together. At some point, she would not be able to say exactly when Amelia looked around the table and felt the specific, unfamiliar, entirely unanticipated sensation of sufficiency, not of having everything she had ever wanted, not of having arrived at some final destination, just of being exactly where she was, with exactly the people she was with, and finding that it was enough, more than enough. It was, she thought, the most valuable thing she had ever been given. And it had not been bought or built or earned. It had simply been allowed. The last thing she said to Ethan that night, after her father had gone home in the car, Ethan had quietly called for him, and Lily had been transferred, still sleeping, to the guest room with a precision born of long practice, was almost nothing. They were standing at the window together looking out at the city, and she was thinking about a particular evening in Colorado that had started everything, and the specific improbability of the path that had led from there to here. She thought about the 9 dates and the parking structure, and the too strong coffee, and the coffee shop with the mismatched chairs and the chalkboard listing 3 items. She thought about the ring on his finger and the name Sarah, and a company that had once been worth $90 million, and a man who had never told anyone what he had traded it for, who had sat across from her in a small restaurant, with mountain views, and refused the door she opened because he believed the answer to her question was more important than the opportunity behind it. She thought about a river path at dusk and the words, "So am I," and the way a person's whole posture can change when they finally put something heavy down and allow themselves to be seen without the weight of it. "My dad always said I needed a husband," she said. It was not exactly a joke and not exactly a confession. It landed somewhere between them in the warm darkness of the apartment. True in the way that things are true when they have traveled a long distance to arrive somewhere they were always going. Ethan turned to look at her. The wedding ring on his finger caught the light from the city for a moment, and she looked at it the way she had looked at it 100 times by now, not with the uncertainty of the early days, but with something like gratitude, because it was part of who he was, and who he was had changed everything. He reached over and took her hand. "Maybe what you really needed," he said quietly, "was someone who reminded you what love looks like." She stood at the window with his hand in hers, and the city sprawled out below them in all its complicated, luminous, ordinary beauty. And she thought about what it means to be a person who has spent years building things that could be measured revenues and market share and headcounts and valuations, and then discovers, not at the end but somewhere in the middle, that the thing that actually sustains a life is the one that cannot be measured at all. Money can build an empire. Success can build a reputation. A career pursued with discipline and intelligence and genuine courage can build something that outlasts the person who started it. All of that is real, and all of it matters, and none of it is diminished by what she had learned in this strange, unexpected, quietly transformative year. But only real love, the kind that stays when there is nothing to gain from staying, the kind that gives without accounting, the kind that declines a fortune to sit beside a hospital bed because that is simply where love requires you to be, the kind that holds a ring on its finger years after the person who placed it there has gone because the truth of that person deserves to be honored. Only that kind of love can turn the 42nd floor of a tower with a view of city lights into something that actually, finally, feels like home. And she had been standing in that apartment for years, looking at those lights, before a quiet man in a coffee shop in Colorado had looked at her with the clear, unhurried eyes of someone who was not after anything, and asked her the question she had needed someone to ask. Not whether she was successful, not whether she was impressive or driven or deserving of admiration, but whether she was capable of loving someone when they had nothing left to offer except their heart. She thought, holding his hand at the window, that she was finally ready to find out. She thought, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives when a long question has been given its answer, that she already knew, and the knowing felt like something she would carry for the rest of her life. Not as a trophy or an achievement, not as a lesson in the professional sense, but as the quiet and permanent understanding that the best things she had ever built were not the ones that had made her name. They were the ones she had built slowly, carefully, and with the whole of herself. A Saturday in a park with an orange jacket and facts about sea turtles, a dinner table in a penthouse where no one talked about business, a hand held on a river path in the evening dark. Those were the ones that would last. Those were the ones that mattered. She looked at the man who had once left her speechless with a single honest sentence, the man who had given up everything for love and never asked for credit, the man whose daughter was asleep in the next room with an orange jacket under her head, and she understood clearly and without reservation, perhaps for the first time in her 36 years, that she had not been missing a husband. She had been missing this, exactly this, and she had found it in the last place her carefully structured life would have thought to look. A coffee shop with mismatched chairs and a hand-painted sign. And a man who had simply been allowed to be himself. Her father had said she needed a husband. And she had spent the better part of a year testing that theory against the world. And the world had sent her back a different answer entirely. Not a husband as a solution to loneliness, not a partner as a hedge against time, not a companion as a corrective to the specific silence of a penthouse on a Tuesday night. What the world had sent her was a question she had not thought to ask herself, delivered by a man who asked it without agenda and waited for her to find the answer on her own terms. And the answer, when it finally arrived, not at a boardroom table or in a quarterly report, but on a river path at dusk, with cold air on her face and her hand in his,